Charles Leclerc breathed fresh life into the F1 22 title fight today by beating Max Verstappen to win the Austrian Grand Prix. But it was a race that saw an unusually high number of penalties be handed out by the stewards. So why was that, and what is it about this circuit that makes there so many penalties get awarded? Welcome to Paddock Packdown. So it was Charles Leclerc's day here in Austria, a win that has closed the gap at the top of the standings to 38 points. But one of the big talking points throughout the race was the number of penalties being handed out. Now, track limits was a really big issue here in Austria. It always does tend to be. But today we saw 43 different instances where track limits were reported, and 4 drivers received a 5-second time penalty for breaching track limits on too many occasions. It seems a bit of a pedantic thing, and to go over all of that from today's race, I'm joined by Autosport Formula 1 editor Matt Q. We've got the lovely Austrian hills behind us as well, so a very nice backdrop for it. Matt, there's a lot of penalties being dished out today. Did it feel a bit like the stewards were a little bit trigger happy in terms of being too quick to give out a penalty to the drivers throughout today's race?
Yeah, I think they did. It was flashing up on the screens constantly. It's not a great look. We could hear the drivers' frustration. It was coming through in a press conference. But the precedent had been set. They had made their own bed by sort of imposing all during the junior single-seater races. So we had F3 in a wet, so there was no traction, drivers going off everywhere, and sort of the usual Formula 2 chaos. And so, we might come on to talk about consistency. That's been a big buzzword in a press conference after about how inconsistent 2 driver stewards are. But if you just sort of boil that down to one day, you can't then police the junior categories one way. This is a feeder series, so they're meant to be learning about F1, and then do the main gig completely differently. So they made their bed and then they had to lie on it. It just wasn't very comfortable for us.
No, you are very right there. A lot of drivers were very critical after the race as well. Lando Norris, he spoke about how he ran wide at turn 1, went over the sausage curb, and that was deemed as his third track limits breach. That resulted in his 5-second time penalty. Max Verstappen called it a bit of a joke across all 3 categories, F1, F2 and F3. So I think the drivers, they're pretty vocal about it, and it is something we do see a lot in Formula 1 in terms of this discussion. But I asked Pierre Gasly about it because he was one of the drivers who received a penalty. And he said, well, it's the same for everybody. Is that enough of an excuse though? It is the same for everybody, but does it make it right?
I'd say not necessarily, because then you can go, if you have gravel traps everywhere or sausage curbs everywhere, that's the same for everyone. But I suppose there's, that can inflict different punishments on it. We saw Perez getting turned around. You can have people getting beat. You can have people going over sausage curves and get floor damage, and that can obviously affect people in different ways depending on the amount of damage. So it's not a precise science if you leave it up to the track, but what you're doing by having outside intervention with the FIA or this sort of VAR equivalent that we just hear nothing about, then it's meant to be routine, but it's not being. So you might as well leave it up to the environment and make it sort of random but self-policing if you're not going to have that consistency. Otherwise, we're just occupying this odd middle ground at the minute.
Now, you mentioned that word consistency. It's something that F1 drivers have talked about a lot, particularly this weekend when we heard that Sebastian Vettel stormed out of the drivers' briefing over discussions over track limits and various things that seem way down the list of priorities for the FIA. The FIA, they actually issued something after the race about track limits that they recognised it had been a talking point over the weekend. And they said that at the start of the season, the drivers said, we want consistency. So the new race director, Niels Wittich, he said that, well, okay, the white line is the edge of the track. It's as simple as that. Now, that works at many circuits, but when you come somewhere like Austria, where the design of the track, particularly through turn 9 and turn 10, kind of lends itself to the drivers to run wide anyway, over the curbs, you're going to lose some time. Is that not enough, or do you think they could maybe have a bit of leeway in terms of saying, for this track, the white line actually isn't always the limit?
You do have to be flexible. It's not one size fits all. I think that works, I suppose, if all the tracks are designed and built at the same time, all like refurbed at the same time to make it really linear. But obviously you have different ways of policing it, and those corners you talk about 9 and 10, they have that beyond the sort of red and white rumble strip. They have this really sort of deceptively serrated, sort of quite jagged curb, and so that's uncomfortable to run over. It can damage cars, it can damage tyres, and there's also this full fact that by running over there, you're like extending how far the car has to go, so you're losing time anyway. And I think the argument of whether you should do it at this track specifically is because it's like a repeat offender. This is a bad one. You need to almost have 20 stewards to monitor every single driver's onboards, because whether we saw it with qualifying with Perez getting through to Q3 and then realising there'd been a track limits violation, binning him out, and then that screwing up Gasly's running order, you don't have that consistency again. And so if you're missing one, but the other driver's getting a black and white flag, and then they do it again, and then they're getting a 5-second penalty, but then the other driver's only just caught to get the black and white flag, again, if it's not 100%, if it's not routine, then there's a flaw in the system. So I appreciate that we're saying it's inconsistent, and the way to manage that is to be inconsistent between circuits, but you have to have that nuance. You have to soften it and sort of play the hand you're dealt, and at this circuit that's probably a bit more leeway.
Definitely. It's been an issue for years. I remember talking to Callum Ilott when he was in Formula 3, and he went on this rant for about half an hour about track limits here, so it's definitely not a new thing. And something else that wasn't a new thing was some of the on-track clashes we saw this weekend. In the race, we saw Sergio Perez and George Russell. They had a collision that resulted in a 5-second time penalty for George Russell, which he felt was a bit unfair. We also saw the clash between Pierre Gasly and Sebastian Vettel. We saw Gasly and Hamilton at Turn 1 yesterday. So it's not been a good weekend for Gasly, has it? But it's a track that... Do you think the design of it, the fact we've kind of got these not quite 90-degree corners, but you look at the pinch points, Turn 1, Turn 3, Turn 4, does it kind of just lend itself to more of these incidents that just mean there will be more penalties?
Perhaps, but it's difficult to say after that race because it was so entertaining, and you saw Verstappen, whether it was against Leclerc, Hamilton, they made racing room. But then I suppose you throw back to the sprint race, you've got Albon getting a 5-second penalty for knocking Norris off. I don't think there's anything fundamental. You play to your limits. These are enormously privileged, well-remunerated drivers. They should be able to find the limit and work to the track they've got. So we've had an entertaining race. That's what you want. So I don't think the track needs redesigning around that to satisfy some complaints. I think you can ask the drivers to do better, and then for the stewards to police it better without sort of being radical.
Yeah, definitely. And finally, I think on the stewards, after the race as well, we had another summons coming through for the top 3 finishers, and all of a sudden we thought, is this going to change who's won the race? We were discussing what's the magazine cover going to look like if things do change that much, and it related to the conduct of the drivers in Parc Fermé. Basically, before the race, they've been told that the physios aren't allowed to come and see them before they've been weighed. It's a known thing in motorsport in terms of, contamination or weight changes or anything like that. And they've been told before the race, look, you can't do this. The physios can't come and see you before you've been weighed. That happened with Leclerc, Verstappen and Hamilton, so our top 3 finishers. And it resulted in a suspended €10,000 fine for all 3 drivers, so no action. The result is final. We saw, as I mentioned, Vettel with his fine for the drivers' briefing storm out, which he said today, I don't want to talk to the FIA about it. Has it been a particularly good look, do you think, for F1's rule makers this weekend, particularly with the post-race thing that seems quite minor?
Yeah, the post-race thing is messy, particularly if you're watching the race on TV, go away and then you check social media a bit, the Autosport website, obviously, and find the stories that, potentially the result has changed. That's not a good look. It's messy. But I think for me, the most egregious thing is the wording of the statement they put out towards Vettel, questioning him as a role model, which I think, if he's gone to that race meeting in his thermals that say "Save the Bees" on the background, that's just not true. And we'll throw back to something we were discussing on the podcast, is that this is a new premiership. We've got 2 race directors because they want to be different to the controversies that rose from 2021. It's, meet the new boss, completely different from the old boss. But we've still got this area where you're not allowed any dissent. Well, not even dissent. You're not allowed to question the FIA. Verstappen gave some really spicy comments. He was asked about the race directors, and he just said, I'd like it if we'd be able to talk to people and they won't be so stubborn. And you've changed the system, but it's still sort of the same philosophy, if you like. And that's obviously a problem. That's why we're talking about it now.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something we're going to be talking about much more in the coming days, I'm sure. Be sure to stay tuned to Autosport. I think there's going to be plenty of debate about that. But Matt, thank you very much for joining me. And yes, a win for Charles Leclerc, lots of penalty debate. The F1 title fight in 2022 seems got a bit more life in it than it did ahead of this weekend. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time from the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard.